At its peak, the Soviet Union was one of the most powerful empires in history, a superpower locked in global struggle with the United States. But by December 1991, this mighty state dissolved into 15 independent countries. How did such a colossal empire collapse? Let's explore step by step the downfall of the Soviet Union. The seeds of the Soviet Union's collapse were planted during the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev. While the USSR appeared stable, its economy started to stagnate. Centralized planning failed to innovate, and corruption became endemic. Oil exports masked deeper problems, but living standards lagged far behind the West. Dissatisfaction simmered beneath the surface. While industry growth rates had been impressive in earlier decades, the centrally planned economy began to falter during Brezhnev's rule. Heavy industries were prioritized over consumer goods, leaving citizens with limited access to basic necessities and modern comforts. The inefficiencies of the planned economy meant that innovation was stifled, and corruption flourished as local officials manipulated quotas and resources for personal gain. Although oil exports temporarily buoyed the economy, they masked deeper systemic problems. This reliance on natural resources as revenue left the USSR vulnerable to future economic shocks, especially as global oil prices fluctuated. Meanwhile, social stagnation mirrored economic decline. Living standards failed to keep pace with those in the West, creating an unspoken dissatisfaction among the populace. Education levels rose, but this only heightened awareness of the country's shortcomings. Brezhnev's leadership style, often described as cautious and conservative, failed to address these growing problems. By the end of his tenure, the Soviet Union appeared outwardly stable, but cracks in its foundations were already forming, paving the way for future upheavals. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan aimed to prop up a communist regime. Instead, it became a costly, decade-long conflict, draining resources and morale. The war eroded the USSR's global reputation and contributed to its growing unrest at home. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a turning point that drained the USSR both militarily and materially.
The Mujahideen. The superpower from the north occupies Afghanistan with more than 100,000 troops. A modern, mechanized army. Their enemy walks and waits in ambush.
Initially intended as a quick intervention to support the communist government in Kabul, the war devolved into protracted conflicts against a well-armed Mujahideen fighters, who were bolstered by the US, Saudis, and Pakistani aid. Soviet troops were ill-prepared for Afghans' harsh terrain and guerrilla warfare tactics, leading to significant casualties and mounting frustrations. The conflict, often referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, became a symbol of imperial overreach and strategic miscalculation. Domestically, the war exacerbated economic strain and increased public's discontent. The state propaganda machine struggled to justify the sacrifices, as returning soldiers and grieved families began to question the government's motives and competence. The financial costs of the war further destabilized an already struggling economy, diverting resources from critical domestic needs. On the international stage, the Soviets' invasion tarnished their reputation, alienated allies, and strengthened the opposition forces during the Cold War. By the time the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989, the war had significantly weakened the USSR's standing on the global stage. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary, promising to revitalize the Soviet Union. His policies of Glasnost and Perestroika aimed to reform the system. Glasnost exposed decades of governmental failures, while Perestroika destabilized the economy further. These reforms gave people a taste of freedom, but also unleashed pent-up frustrations. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed his leadership in 1985, he recognized the dire need to reform and resecure the Soviet Union from its economic and political stagnation. His policies of openness and restructuring were groundbreaking but ultimately very destabilizing. The openness policies encouraged transparency, allowing the citizens and the media openly to discuss the country's problems for the first time. While creating a sense of hope and freedom, it also exposed decades of corruption, mismanagement, and human rights abuses, fueling widespread dissatisfaction with the government. Perestroika, on the other hand, aimed to modernize the Soviet economy by introducing a market-oriented reforms. However, these changes disrupted the already fragile system, leading to shortages, inflation, and decline in industry output. Enterprises struggled to adapt to the new hybrid model, while workers and managers alike resisted change. Instead of revitalizing the economy, Perestroika exacerbated the collapse, undermining the public trust in Gorbachev's leadership. These reforms inadvertently empowered nationalist movements in the Soviet republics, as groups began demanding greater autonomy or outright independence. Gorbachev's well-intentioned efforts to save the Soviet Union instead accelerated its fragmentation. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was in freefall. Industrial output plummeted, and basic goods became scarce. Raising inequality fueled anger. Strikes and protests became common, and workers demanded their wages and conditions to be improved. The Soviet Union's economy, already stagnant under Brezhnev, and strained by the Afghan War, spiraled into a full-blown crisis during the 1980s. Gorbachev's attempts at economic reform through Perestroika only heightened the inefficiencies of the planned economy without resolving them. Enterprises were given limited autonomy to make decisions, but this halfway approach confused managers and disrupted the established supply chains. Inflation skyrocketed as the government printed more money to cover deficits. Basic consumer goods became ever scarce. Citizens faced long lines for bread, sugar, and other essentials, fueling anger, despair. In addition, the Soviet government's vast expenditure on military and space programs drained the resources of the citizens' economy. Defense spending, estimated to have consumed 25% of GDP, left little room for infrastructure or technological advancements. By the late 1980s, oil prices collapsed, depriving the USSR of the primary source of foreign currency and worsening the fiscal crisis. The economic collapse undermined public confidence in the Communist Party, which could no longer provide a standard of living it once promised. Strikes and protests erupted, particularly among the miners and industrial workers, signalling that even the traditional loyal working class had lost their faith in the regime. Ethnic tensions and nationalism surged in the USSR republics. In the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, independence movements gained momentum. Other republics followed, demanding autonomy or outright independence. Gorbachev's attempts to maintain unity increasingly failed. As the Soviet economy's woes worsened, long simmering ethnic and national tensions within its diverse republics came to a forefront. The USSR was a multi-ethnic empire comprised of over 100 nationalities and 15 republics, each of which had its own language, culture, and history. Policies of Russification during earlier decades had marginalized non-Russian cultures, creating resentment in places like the Baltic states, Ukraine, and the Caucasus. Gorbachev's Glasnost unintentionally provided platforms for these grievances to be aired, leading to an explosion of nationalist movements across the USSR. The Baltic states, like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were among the first to demand independence. In these republics, mass protests and human chains became powerful symbols of resistance against the Soviet rule. Elsewhere, similar movements gained traction as republics like Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova began pushing for autonomy or outright independence, further heightening the fragmentation of the Union. Gorbachev's attempts to quell separatist movements, such as deploying troops to Lithuania, backfired as violent crackdowns only strengthened calls for independence. By 1991, many republics had declared their sovereignty, effectively dissolving the Soviet Union from within. In August of 1991, hardline communists staged a coup, placing Gorbachev under house arrest. But the coup backfired, sparking mass protests led by Boris Yeltsin. The coup's failure weakened the central government and accelerated the Union's unraveling. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, replaced by independent states. The Cold War, superpower, was no longer. The final blow to the Soviet Union was in the August of 1991, where the hardline communist leaders had taken the coup action. Frustrated by Gorbachev's reforms and the disintegration of the central authority, these officials placed Gorbachev under house arrest and declared a state of emergency. The coup faced widespread opposition, thousands of citizens gathering in Moscow to defend democratic reforms. Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Soviet Federalist Socialist Republic, emerged as a central figure in the resistance. Standing atop a tank, Yeltsin denounced the coup and rallied the public. The coup's failure accelerated the unravelling of the Soviet state. Gorbachev returned to power, but was politically weakened, while Yeltsin gained a prominence and a control over key institutions in Russia. In the months that followed, the republics declared independence one after another, with little opposition from Moscow. On the 8th of December 1991, leaders from Russia, Ukraine and Belarus signed the Belozia Accords, formally dissolving the Soviet Union and replacing it with the Commonwealth of Independent States. By December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as the president and the Soviet flag was lowered for one last time over the Kremlin.
Mingling with the rush hour traffic, Red Army armoured personnel carriers on the streets of Moscow this morning, heading to the Kremlin. They first moved in at 4 a.m., the first sign of the coup d'etat that removed Mikhail Gorbachev from power. With tanks in Red Square, the official word from the new government, calling itself the National Emergency Committee, was that the architect of Glasnost and Perestroika was too ill to continue in office. A short statement reminiscent of the Soviet Union's past was broadcast by state television.
В связи с невозможностью по состоянию здоровья исполнения Горбачевым Михаилом Сергеевичем своих обязанностей президента СССР на основании статьи 127 пункт 7 Конституции СССР вступил в исполнение обязанностей президента СССР с 19 августа 1991 года вице-президент СССР Янаев.
By mid-morning, APCs were ringing the Defence Ministry and most government buildings. From many people on the streets, the reaction was one of sheer surprise and resignation. Others pinned their hopes on non-communist politicians to come to the nation's aid.
The fall of the Soviet Union was not a single event, but a series of missteps, internal crises and systemic failures. Its collapse reshaped the world, ending the Cold War, leaving the post-Soviet legacy, which still impacts global politics today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share your thoughts below.